Hi there, my name is Jo Baldwin-Trott. This is the Amijo show. I am the host and I'm also one of the directors of 50/50 Parliament. I have been running this show for a little while during lockdown and it will continue afterwards. But I am thrilled today to have a very special guest and someone who I have been championing for a long time, all the way from exactly in her office right now, as you can see from the backdrop. Welcome to MP for East Fife, Wendy Chamberlain. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Jo.
Great to see you. We will get to meet physically one day.
I know.
Spoken on the phone for a long time. Now we've been Zooming in for a little while, but I really appreciate you coming on the call. So as I mentioned before we kind of started recording, there's a million gazillion questions I would love to ask you and things to talk about. So we will have a conversation again, I'm sure, but you were very kindly found the time on Wednesday evening prior to probably one of the biggest days you've had in Parliament so far, I think is what the way.
Yeah, I think that'd probably be fair.
You managed to squeeze in some time and come on to one of our 50/50 Lib Dem bite-sized evenings, and this is a new kind of inspiration for 50/50, which is the group that is really endeavouring to achieve equal Parliament in the UK, because at this rate we're going to achieve equal Parliament in 2070. Which is it's not just unacceptable, it's just the thought of that, it gives me chills. So we have to work hard to do that, and obviously Wendy is a great advocate and is kindly offering her help to support 50/50. So obviously great to have you on. Let's start with what happened on Thursday, because obviously, and then we'll come back to 50, but obviously you have an incredible amount going on for you right now in Parliament.
Yeah. So obviously, as a Liberal Democrat, we didn't have the election in December that we would have hoped for. So we have 11 MPs, and that means that we're obviously sharing the load in terms of portfolios and spokesperson roles. So I actually have 5, and one of those is the Department for International Development. So hopefully your viewers will have seen the fact that the government announced on Tuesday the intention to merge the Department for International Development with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And that's not something that we're supportive of, and neither are NGOs across the sector. So having had that announcement from the government on Tuesday, I tabled what we call an urgent question, which was granted by the Speaker and heard yesterday. So what that means is that it requires the Secretary of State to come to the House to answer the urgent question. And really the reason why we were looking at that was because the announcement had come completely out the blue, and what came on Tuesday from the Prime Minister was quite bereft of detail. So what I wanted to do in the urgent question was to ask about how had staff been made aware, because we'd heard reports that they had only been made aware on social media that this was coming, and what that meant for the actual jobs, whether they were going to stay, and then really quite crucially what it meant for aid across the developing world during coronavirus, because as you can imagine, since I've come into role, we've been having lots of discussions with NGOs, and the fact that just because COVID-19 is here, it doesn't mean that other crises are not happening or other challenges, and actually COVID can potentially be more damaging in those countries because of lack of sanitation, inability to social distance, and all the things that we are doing. So we're asking about that. And then also I think one of the other big concerns is DFID actually performs incredibly well in terms of how it spends its money and how the transparency around that, whereas the Foreign Commonwealth Office is recognised is not good and performs poorly. So I was asking questions about what was going to happen there. And then finally, the Liberal Democrats, through a private member's bill in 2014, secured the 0.7% of gross national income to be spent on aid. And we want clarity and commitment that that's still going to be the case. There is this saying of charity begins at home, but actually I increasingly disagree with that. I think actually true charity is reaching beyond our borders and supporting those. And actually that is a benefit to us in the longer term. If we look at COVID, for example, if other countries in the world fail to deal with COVID effectively, then we will continue to see COVID in the UK. Interestingly, I saw the latest outbreak in China. It's reportedly a European strain of coronavirus that is responsible for that outbreak. So we live in a global world. We are dealing with challenges that know no boundaries, And I think it's really important the UK has been a global leader in respect of aid. And so this is a monumental change. And clearly, with the government the size of majority, it will be happening, but we absolutely need to ensure that that's not at the detriment to the world's most vulnerable. So yeah, I had 2 minutes to respond to Dominic Raab's initial response to me, and it was good fun's not the right word, but I think over the last 6 months I do feel that I've kind of grown in confidence in terms of my chamber contributions. So was clear about what I was going to say, and went and did it. My mum is very pleased that the drama lessons from back in school are paying off, because I suppose there is that bit about standing up and making your voice heard in somewhere that you've watched on the television it is quite daunting, or not daunting, but you pinch yourself a bit.
I'm not surprised, and it is amazing that everything counts. I really believe that everything we've done, and also you have been a police officer. You've got 2 kids that you've got to stand up to as well in some ways.
Yeah, and I've got 2 older stepchildren as well, both in their 20s, who are police officers too. So it's a bit of a family trait.
Because obviously your dad was a police officer, your husband was a police officer.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
You are fully surrounded, aren't you?
yes, absolutely, and good to I'm very proud of both my stepchildren and what they're doing as well, and it also is giving me an insight to the current challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just amazing what you've actually achieved. Obviously, getting your seat in East Fife, the first female MP, especially because of the seat being East Fife. And the history that has, this Mr. Asquith,
yes, who obviously was not a supporter of universal suffrage at all. In fact, quite the reverse, was an active proponent, adversary to it. And actually, so when it was the centenary of 1918, I did go in Cooper Library. So Cooper's the kind of administrative centre of the constituency. Went to it was a talk all about the suffragettes in North East Fife, which seemed to basically involve chasing Asquith and Churchill and others off golf courses. So golf was important 100 years ago, as it is now for the constituency. But one wee interesting tidbit is there's another place, Ladybank, which is a Masonic hall just across the road from the train station, and it's got a plaque on it, related to Asquith, and that's simply because obviously very, very different in terms of how we relate to constituencies now as MPs, but he would literally get off the train at Ladybank, make a speech at the Masonic Hall, everybody would say, "We love you, Asquith," and then you'd get back on the train again.
Wow. If only it was that easy.
yes. That whole bit about finding a constituency as parliamentarians did in those times, but and previously to that as well, and no real need to have any kind of connection to it, or indeed visit it in any real way, shape or form.
Wow, it's just a pin on the map then, I guess.
And that's one of the things that's been really challenging about the COVID crisis, particularly as a newly elected MP, is about how do you make, when you can't be out and about in the constituency. My Saturdays, under normal circumstances, there would be events happening every weekend, and I would be at them. How do you make yourself visible, or how do you amplify the work that you're doing? So it has meant obviously increased use of social media, but also actually doing a lot of work with getting press releases into some of the local newspapers, because accepting that it's an older population in my constituency generally, so they're not necessarily constituents who are always engaging with social media or at all.
Yeah, and it's important that everyone feels valued. Obviously, Jo Switson, had a terrible time with her own constituency. But it's one of the many challenges, isn't it, of being an MP? Obviously, you are a mum of two too, and there is so much to juggle. And this is definitely a factor that puts women off from standing. It puts women off from standing into professional executive roles, let alone as members of Parliament. But what would be, just give us an overview of your journey into that, and how you've managed that, because it does put so many women off from leading.
Yeah, absolutely. So for myself, I joined the Liberal Democrats in 2015. Joe, you know this. I always joke crying at Nick Clegg on the telly, but I'd always supported the Liberal Democrats, wasn't necessarily happy with everything that they did in coalition, but was supportive, and really felt at that point that I could no longer sit in my hands, that if I believed in those Liberal values, then I needed to do something to make them heard. So joined the party and was just basically a keen and enthusiastic activist up until 2017, where I did two things. One, I agreed to be a paper candidate in the council elections in Scotland in a multi-member ward, just to see what it was like and support the target ward. And then when the snap general election was called, North East Fife was an all-women shortlist. So the party, Willie Rennie primarily, who's the Scottish leader and the MSP for the majority of the constituency, was trying to make sure that he was encouraging as many women to think about applying as possible, and women that he thought would be suitable. And he phoned me, and I have to say, I had kind of, when I saw he tried to phone me, because I don't think I was well that day, I did remember thinking, oh, he's going to ask me to be like a paper candidate or something with the snap. And when he actually said, no, I think you should apply for North East Fife, which was a target seat for us even then, because we'd held it with Ming Campbell from 1987 right through to 2015. We only lost it when he stood down, obviously during the SNP surge after the independence referendum as well. And I remember I almost burst into tears when I got off the phone to think, he actually thinks that I could put myself forward for something like that. And although I wasn't I went for it with no real expectation, but it was more about what experience can I gain from doing this. And actually, I think it was absolutely, the candidate that was chosen had been a councillor for a number of years, although she was retiring from the council. She was very well known in the constituency, and she was absolutely the right person for the circumstances of that snap. And to be honest, I don't think, I would, the experience that I got from that and the subsequent times until 2019 have absolutely stood me in good stead. So after 17, North East Fife became the most marginal seat in the UK. There was only 2 votes between the SNP and ourselves, and Elizabeth Richards decided quite an early stage that she wasn't going to stand again. So I knew that the seat was going to be back up for contention. And although I hadn't been selected, I was in the constituency every weekend, because I was working full time at that point, every weekend helping. And so got to know the local party. They saw me as a hard worker. They didn't see me as somebody who had taken the huff, as it were, when they hadn't chosen me. But as well as that, was the paper candidate in the seat of Stirling, which gave me experience of hustings. The local newspapers there, they wanted like 300 words every week. I remember also doing a radio show where you had to choose your two songs on the show as well, and I probably worried more about what the 2 songs were going to be rather than what I was going to say. And that I ended up initially, I had song that was played at my husband and I's wedding, John Martin, and then I was going to choose something like Blue Tones, and I went, oh, that's all men, so I need to think of something else. So my other song was Casey Musgraves, the country singer, and it's her song called Follow Your Arrow, which I actually think is quite a liberal song. And it's got a line in it about, roll up a joint or don't. And so I joked that it was like a nice reference to our cannabis policy as well. So that was 17. And then the party, I think, made the very sensible decision to select quickly, because I think the reality was everybody knew that this Parliament wasn't going to last the full term, and they wanted to give the new candidate the best opportunity to bed in, because we obviously had a great bar chart with only the 2 votes. So I was selected in June 2018, and really over that sort of 18-month period was working with Willie Rennie as the MSP, and just knocking as many doors as possible, attending as many events as possible, and just really getting to know the wider communities. So it did mean that when we, when things all came to head in November last year, I was in a very good position. I've got my hair tied up today, but my hair's quite long and curly, and so it's quite a distinguishing feature. So folk, if they'd had a few leaflets with my face on the door when I knocked on it, they invariably knew who I was. But the other thing I would say that it also gave me the opportunity to do was to sort of, you know, that juggling that you talked about. So I'm very fortunate that my husband is semi-retired. He does a little bit of part-time consulting, but he is the default parent and has been probably for almost 4 years. He still doesn't know like their shoe sizes because like they don't, but but in terms of he's the person that does the ferrying about to events and you know, gets the emails from the school and things like that. So because realistically for me, I was working at for Diageo, the drinks company, in learning and development, and I was sometimes up in the north of Scotland at our whisky distilleries, sometimes over in Dublin as well. So I was doing that, and then 2 nights a week would be our canvassing nights, and then we'd have a you know, my Saturday was usually out and about as well. So in some ways the actual campaign, when it came round in November, was almost a little bit of a break, because I only had the campaign to worry about, as opposed to, you know, what had been extensive long days. So I suppose, you know, it depends on the job that you're in, but a supportive employer, or at the very least an employer you can be honest with about your ambitions, is hugely helpful. And you know, for a company like Diageo to have a member of parliament as a former member of staff, indeed Priti Patel's a former employee of Diageo as well, is obviously you know, they see the benefits of that too. And yeah, I was very fortunate that was who I was with.
Yeah, and it's always about communication, isn't it? And just really being like with your kids, with your partner, and getting as much help as you can to support you.
Yeah.
But actually, it's I think, you know, everyone is an agreement. You know, well, a large proportion of men and women in this country are in agreement that we need equality in governance. And actually, who doesn't want to support that? You know,
absolutely.
And I think the thing that actually that I've come across in interviewing a lot of women for at 50/50, and just in my own work as a mentor actually, is that women tend to think of themselves as then seeing themselves as suddenly being isolated, and because as they see a leadership role as something that's sort of removed from everyone else. But actually you're not. You're only one step ahead, aren't you, really? And it's about having that team around you.
Yeah, absolutely.
That can support you. One thing I'd love to come back to, Wendy, is you've just spoken about your gradual journey. You know, although some bits of it were kind of fast forwarded a bit, but you know, it's again something that's so important to value, is actually just by getting involved in your local council, your local executive team. If your executive team isn't too great, whatever your party, then actually just connect on a community level and have a dig around for some other female councillors or MPs that you can relate to, but probably councillors, and get involved on a local basis. Because I must admit, I was a very similar, but obviously for council, I thought I was going to be a paper candidate. I thought I'd just join the exec, help with a bit of fundraising, and before I knew it, I was running around with banners with my name on it, kind of slightly like dumbfounded. It's like, oh my gosh, this is really happening. I could end up being a councillor. But it all helps you, doesn't it? Find your feet and actually grow and get stronger in your voice of what matters to you. Because actually, that's what politics is for me. Is it's just about your values and what matters. How have you found that sort of transitioning from your values at home to?
So I think there's two sort of bits to that. I think, you know, what's the worst that can happen? That old sort of, you know, feel the fear and do it anyway. I think all of us come to accept that, you know, and I've got this, so my kids are 15 and 12, you know, I've got this at the moment with you know, the sort of whole growth mindset piece and things, as in, you know, much better to be in a position of having tried something and not being successful, as opposed to not being successful because you didn't attempt in the first place. And I don't know, you know, there's maybe a little bit of maturity on my part in terms of, would I have done this 10 years ago? Possibly not, but I would certainly counsel, regardless of age, for people to do that. And then there is the other bit, and I think I mentioned this on Wednesday, you know, my dad is quite direct, quite straightforward, you know, Scottish man of a certain age, and he said, you know, when you're getting involved in all this stuff, he said, you know, I think you're off your heat. And then he said, and then I look at those idiots in the telly, and I think you can be just as good as them. And actually, there is that bit of, you know, just having a bit of self-belief that you've got something of worth to contribute, even if, you know, for myself, in terms of my career to date, in terms of the stuff that I've done, I mean, I wasn't in, you know, I was a police officer for the 12 years, you know, I wasn't promoted. You know, I've done a couple of managerial roles, but, you know, I've not been in any directorships or anything like that. But that doesn't matter. It's about actually, and interestingly, you know, that was very much the sort of campaign that we ran in North East Fife, was that I had real life experience so that I understood the challenges that constituents are facing. And actually, you know, I think increasingly as a society, we don't put people up on a pedestal, and you know, just because I've got 2 letters after my name, why should I? The other thing I said on Wednesday night was, in terms of how I'm working with my team, is, you know, just because I'm an MP doesn't mean I necessarily know any better than anybody else what to do with it, with a bit of casework. So we have, you know, a weekly call, obviously a weekly call because we're not physically together at the moment, where, you know, we chew over the sort of more difficult casework and we reach a consensus about how we're going to approach it. You know, and so my team, in terms of how they deal with casework, is, you know, I don't want them to be pretending to be me. I want them to develop a value and worth and their own self-development in terms of taking ownership of cases that they're dealing with too, and having the trust in them that they will, you know, if they need help, they will ask for it, because the reality is there are some things where it's only the MP who can, you know, make the difference. And it means that when we get successes, because we had our call this morning, and we had a case where it was an appeal against a PIP assessment, and the decision's been reversed, and it meant that, you know, my caseworker as an individual, you know, got the credit and got the success, as opposed to and we all felt it as a wider team. And I think that's really important, that you know, the MP is only part of a team that actually does the work in the constituency and in support of constituents.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also that, I think that probably helps women think, well, that will be there for me too. And
yes,
it's
yes,
really
absolutely,
simple,
absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt the very initial stage of being elected as a parliamentarian is, and I'm not somebody who kind of watched Parliament TV in my spare time, albeit I obviously was with all the Brexit stuff going on more latterly, but in terms of all the protocols and processes and things, you know, I think I've demonstrated that I was quite busy. But you literally walk off the stage at the count and you're handed a brown envelope that says Member of Parliament, and you open it and there's a letter and a wee booklet, but the letter is basically, call this number, and they sort out your accommodation and your transport for coming down. And then you're, you know, obviously then you spend the Friday trying to sleep, but also trying to do, you know, media and all those kind of things. And I, on the Friday, actually went into my work to hand over my laptop, because there you go, I wasn't coming back. And then you're in London on the following Monday. And there is we did have a couple of sort of training, I wouldn't even call them trainings, more information sessions with the Electoral Commission, with IPSA, who are obviously the independent body that manage our pay and expenses, with HR. But the reality is from the Monday, there is an email address, wendy.chamberlain.mp@parliament.uk, and that's how your constituents, those emails start coming. And you have to, you know, that team I had to build at the same time. You know, my 5th day in Parliament, which was, you know, just before Christmas, that's my birthday as well, it was my first votes against Brexit. At the same time as, I need I need to build a team. So I think there's definitely more that could be done by Parliament to make that easier, even just like an initial pool of people to support you, or something like that, because you know, with my background in L&D and HR, you know, having the right people and getting that right diversity of people and ability in your team is really important.
And I guess because obviously Lib Dems, unfortunately, are still fairly small, whereas if you were a Conservative MP, I suppose that the network would almost engulf you as
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, so the benefits, one of the few benefits of our performance was the fact that we had more offices on the parliamentary estate than we now needed. So I literally came to see this office, which used to be Layla's, that first week, and when I came back at the beginning of January, it was all set up. It was all set up for me. There was Conservatives who, for a number of weeks, were literally on a laptop in PCH, and then I do wonder about some of those new MPs in seats that they've never had. So I'm thinking of those sort of red wall seats as they were in the north, and in what that local knowledge ability, that might be quite difficult to recruit. So yeah, it's but in terms of, I suppose, the big operation behind, yes. So we obviously had the Lib Dem team plus the people in the Whip's office and things like that. But and we all got assigned buddies. So Layla was my buddy. But I think the reality is there's no right way to do this. I think I said that again on Wednesday as well, in terms of there's just different ways of being an MP and managing the workload, and how you do things, how you manage things in terms of casework, how you manage things in terms of what you do in the chamber. At the moment, my researcher is doing the initial draft of my speeches, and then I'll kind of take it from there. With some MPs that write everything from scratch themselves, and I think that thing will change and develop for me over time. But it is definitely quite challenging, and the skills to be a candidate, the skills to be an MP, and the skills to be a people manager are actually quite difficult. So again, I think I said this on Wednesday, but it's in some ways it's just trying to push all those circles as much as possible, so my sweet spot gets bigger over the next 4 years.
Yeah, definitely. And isn't it about just doing it your way? Because actually the electorate, one way or another, have entrusted you to be their MP, and actually therefore that gives you permission to do it your way.
Absolutely.
And that is you with your background, being a mum, with your your educational background as well as your career background. And I think what we're seeing now at last, in my mind, is that actually, thankfully, there's a more varied kind of background coming through of who our MPs are.
And I think that can only be good for that can only be good culturally. So next week, we're going to be debating the sort of final elements or final pieces of the jigsaw in relation to the complaints process, independent complaints process here in Parliament for parliamentarians. And actually, I think I'm very, very keen that is something that becomes a matter of course. People should be. It comes back to this whole tradition thing. So the tradition is that MPs kind of govern themselves, and so that's why they determine the sanctions and stuff. I'm sorry, I just don't think that's acceptable now. That's why we don't deal with our expenses and our salary. It's determined by an independent body, and I don't think complaints should be managed by us either, because the bottom line is we're members of Parliament, but we're politicians. So you can't stop the politics coming into it, because that's actually what we do. And how do you engender confidence in these processes so that people who have been victims of bullying, harassment, or even worse, have the confidence to come forward and feel that that they will be dealt with fairly? Because it's being very conscious of, yes, in some respects I'm a line manager, that in a very simple term, I've got line manager in my team, but there's a huge power imbalance that those two letters bring, I suppose.
Yeah, and bringing on to that subject, so obviously, sadly, there's been a lot of press. I mean, Julia Gillard's speech is one that is almost ingrained in my head. I just think one of the most powerful uncoverings of discrimination that you can get. And obviously there's so much we could cover on discrimination, but coming back to equality, and actually, again, sadly, it is something that puts women off. And there is so much discrimination, even from people I have heard even recently in the Scottish Party, for example, heard that happening. So it's a big issue. It needs to change. What already could you see, or would you like to see happen to prevent this? Because I appreciate it's in the culture, but it does need to change. It's something that needs to be addressed. In my mind, and I've suffered a fair bit of discrimination in the police, and I don't know, you
Yes.
did too. Well, that's definitely probably a glass of wine chat, but
Yes.
I think probably some of it needs to be aired. But just on the outset, for the purpose of this conversation, what do you think could be definitely done differently to make it better in Parliament and for government?
So I think if I think about, I think the work that 50/50 and other organisations for underrepresented groups are doing is very key to it, because I think there is that bit of accessibility. There's a reason why our politics is dominated by white men of a certain age and a certain class, because they have the finances or they have the family setups, etc., that allow them to do that. And there is also the sort of, well, is it a sense of entitlement? Not so much maybe that, but a sense of expectation that it's something that's a credible pathway to them. So I think there's that aspect. And then I think about myself and what I've been trying to do since my election, in terms of I'm a leader within the party now. That's the reality, even if I don't always feel like that from the old imposter syndrome. So it's about how can I use my influence well. And so there are some very direct things I can do. So I've referred to the complaints process. I'm actually leading the piece of work within the Lib Dem parliamentary party to ensure that we wholly adopt the independent complaints process, and that we ensure that it functions well between the Liberal Democrat and the new complaints process as well. So I'm leading on that piece of work. I think one of the key things that I've done there is that I've got staff reps working with me on it, because I want them to feel empowered. It's not Wendy Chamberlain MP has worked on this. We're a working group, so that's one bit. And then the second bit is in terms of individual conversations that I have. So I'm part of a WhatsApp group, which kind of came about, one, when I was going for selection, and two, I think somebody looking for a lift. So WhatsApp, there's about a dozen of us on it, called Lib Dem Ladies, all Scottish members, and I'm jokingly the mammy of the group. But some of that is just that whole encouraging, supporting, and sometimes blowing off a bit of steam. So there's that bit, but there's also me just thinking about having individual conversations with people. And yes, I could then go and intervene, but actually, does that change the culture? Isn't it about empowering the people who are coming to me and supporting them to help them make the change and have the confidence? So I've actually been doing probably quite a wee bit of coaching in the background, just very basic things about how to feed back not good stuff, because I think I can think of a couple of people within the party who I think hugely highly of, and I'm talking men here, and then I hear about something that's happened, and if the person had the confidence to feed back to them, they would be absolutely mortified. They would not, it's that unconscious bias where they would not have considered the implications of that being taken the wrong way. So actually, if you don't tell people the impact that they've had, how can you expect their behaviour to be any different in future? So it's that wee bit of encourage. Is a model called AID, where you sort of you utilise that this is what you did. This is the impact it had on me, because people have to own their impact. That might not be their intention, but that's the impact they've had. They need to own it, and then a sort of discussion about how we can work together differently. So that's kind of the thing that I'm trying to do, because I don't want to be sort of coming in as sort of the saviour all the time, as in I think it's there's again, I suppose a wee bit like what I said in terms of being the MP, there will absolutely be times if I heard something I would go and act on it straight away, but actually how can I empower people to have the confidence to request that change themselves?
Yeah, I think you're right, because it's and And it is the biggest challenge. And sometimes, obviously, it's not easy because you're in a situation, you're feeling vulnerable. And also there's an element, I think, when you desperately want something, and I remember feeling like this in the police. I desperately wanted the next role. And I didn't want to upset anything. You want it so badly. You don't want to upset the apple cart, and disrupt and actually badmouth. But actually, we have to get over that. Because
and as women, we're actually really, really good at soft power, aren't we? But
yeah, we are. But we actually have to own that power. And if I could take myself back now, I would have handled things wholly differently. And also, I think in some cases, there has to be an opportunity to give someone the potential to apologise, because, like you say, politics, like the police, I mean, it's entrenched with all this historic, terrible discrimination, but actually some of it is so stale, but actually it's been accepted along the way that it's not even recognised. Which is
and called tradition. I just find the whole idea of tradition just quite frustrating. There's tradition and there's respect for the way things were done to an extent, but when that tradition impinges on the ability of democracy to function properly, it frankly needs to change.
And I think also, like, expressing what the relevance of something is. For example, when I joined my local exec and I started up a women's group where I am in London, one of the long-standing male members, who's not called David like most councillors, but not a councillor, but a member that's been a long time.
100 as well. I think there's something like there's more men called David or John than there are females in the chief execs in the FTSE 100.
David, yeah, I looked at that research. Anyway, well, that's what we need to change. But when I said about the group, they were actually slightly offended that I was creating a women's group because there wasn't a men's group. And I just said, look around the table. What do you see? Do you see women mostly, or do you see men mostly? It was me and another female in a 15 people executive committee.
Yeah.
But it hadn't occurred to him. That wasn't it was unconscious bias. It hadn't occurred to him that actually there aren't women around this table because they feel threatened by that. Women had come and they'd gone because they weren't given an opportunity to speak. So I really believe that we have to own our space and we have to get bolder about speaking
we
up.
have to get to that critical mass. So you said 2 other women there, but I think all the research suggests that unless it's 3+, then what you've just described in terms of staying for a while and then moving on, or dare I say it, being sort of into the more administrative roles is part of it.
Well, we now have a female chair. We have a mostly female fundraising team. The numbers have quadrupled in only 18 months. It didn't take long. So you're right. Once you start changing the ratio, which is obviously what we need in Parliament, which is obviously what the Labour Party did very well.
Yeah, and it's reminding ourselves of, what are we in politics to do? We're in politics to make positive change, and for the Liberal Democrats aligned with those liberal values and beliefs. And I think there is a bit around that, because often that is people's social life, that becomes, it's quite comfortable to continue in that way and actually forget about the fact that we are not reaching out to, in women's extent, half the population that potentially could vote for us because they're looking for people to relate to. And then when we look at, those from BAME backgrounds or other, minority groups, then, well, if they don't have identifiable role models within our party, why should we expect their vote?
Yeah, absolutely. I think role models are key. I really do. I think that they are fundamental to how we work as humans. We like to think and see, actually, that's what I'd like to do. That's who I could be. But we have to be able to relate to that. And sadly, I think that the failing at the terrible cycle of Parliament has very much been about, it's been the same. So where are the role models? And obviously, Jo Cox's birthday is coming up on Monday. So sadly, for me, one of my role models was her. And actually her husband, who very bravely talked about that more women like Jo, normal women as he described them, which obviously I classed you as, Wendy, but not politician led, not politics degrees, just women that have been on the board of governors at school. I mean, come on. I think I would put that on a par with blooming Parliament any day. Goodness me, they're cutthroat.
Yeah, you're looking at a chair of a parent council right here.
If you can sit around a table of board of governors, a friend of mine was the chair of board of governors, said, you know, you can deal with anyone. You truly can. So those are all skills, and that's what we need. We need more women like Wendy, sat in Parliament, speaking up, asking the difficult questions, maybe with a bit of drama experience too. It doesn't matter, does it? It all helps when it comes down to that moment. You've got to stand up and say your bit.
Absolutely. I mean, my one thing my daughter did say was, "Oh, I liked your top." So these are always things that, you know, get that validation helps as well. In fact, my kids were probably most excited that, you know, in terms of me being elected, what they're most excited about is the fact that I am verified on both Twitter and Instagram. So, you know, you've got to take these moments where you can as a parent sometimes.
You do, and all those moments help when it gets tough, and when, say, you get some negative comments, which obviously we could do a whole talk on another day, I think, because that is again a big issue. But I think, you know, you've got to remember, you've got to bank all that positivity, and when the going gets tough, remind yourself, actually, I did that, because we do make mistakes. Is not the right word.
The final thing I wanted to say, just because I was thinking about it when you were talking about it at the start, and I suppose the aims of 50/50 was, the other thing I did last week was I had an adjournment debate, which is the last 30-minute debate at the end of the day, and that was an electoral reform. And what was interesting in that was I talked about the fact that you know, there's been this perception that women leaders have been better in responding to the coronavirus crisis. So when you think about Angela Merkel or Jacinda Ardern, etc., and I think there, you know, and Nicola Sturgeon, because I think there's definitely been a perception and difference in perception between Scotland and UK government's performances. But interestingly, what's the underlying factor there is every legislature with at least 40% female representation is proportional in representation. It uses a proportional voting system to bring people there. So there is that aspect as well, which I do think we absolutely need to consider. And the reality is, for the two biggest parties, it's not in their interests. But I do firmly believe that it's in democracy's interests.
It absolutely is, because so many women stood, but guess where they were put? Seats that weren't going to win.
Yes,
so
yes,
you know,
absolutely.
we have to bear that in mind. Just because we're seeing women figures coming up, standing for MP, but women are being put strategically into seats that aren't going to win. So I am completely with you that until we have proportional representation, we will continue to see what we do see now.
But it comes back to the culture as well, doesn't it? Because our political culture is adversarial between two big parties, whereas actually, again, you know, you know, just having that working together coalition consensus, I think, is actually much more aligned to where women see their value, which is why, you know, we've talked there about board of governors and parent councils, and, you know, who's on the cake stand at the coffee morning, because it's let's all muck in and achieve what needs to be done.
And that's what needs to happen. The Green Party, as well as the Liberal Democrats, the Women Equality Party, there should be a much more even spread of information passing on.
And we're talking about culture wars at the moment. You know, the Brexit Party got over 600,000 votes in December, and their biggest impact was in standing down, in preventing their voters having the opportunity to vote for them. That suggests to me a system that's not working.
It really isn't. You've just brought onto it. I'm just going to give my book a blatant plug, and partly because one of the authors is obviously the wonderful Frances Scott, who is the founder of 50/50. She gets the last word actually in this book, because for me, until we have more governance that is equal, 50/50 equality in governance, we are never going to get fair systems. And I think we have to be at the table, not be the meal. So if you want some inspiration, please get this book, Women Leading, Jo Baldwin-Trott. It's on Kindle and obviously paperback too. But this is all about inspiring real women, normal women like Wendy, you know, like Jo Cox, and just to get it stuck in, roll up your sleeves, just get stuck in. You are able, you can do it. And reach out to Wendy. She's on Twitter at Wendy
Chamberlain LD, yeah. Wendy Chamberlain LD, yeah.
Fantastic. Wendy, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And this will be obviously put out to 50/50 to hopefully inspire more women to stand and get involved in local councils now with a view to eventually standing for MP, just like you did. Congratulations. Great talking.
Thank you, Jo.